Hi everyone, welcome back. So in this week's lessons, we're going to be introducing a couple of new concepts, starting with arrays in this video, and then in the next video, we're going to get more practice with arrays, and we're also going to start to introduce the idea of objects. So let's dive into it. So before we talk about arrays in JavaScript, we're going to do a little bit of preamble here and try to explain the concept first, and then we'll move on to the syntax and then do an example. So imagine if you were trying to, if you were developing this game of Pac-Man, right? You're trying to program this game. Um, you would need to have some kind of place to store all the information that relates to the game. And by that, I mean, the player here, Pac-Man, the ghosts, right? The position of each ghost, every one of the little dots that Pac-Man has to eat while they're going around, the size and position of these walls, right? All of that information inside the program has to be stored inside variables, right? We've already talked about variables. They are literally the foundation of anything we built with programming. Without variables, we don't have the ability to manipulate information. Up until now, though, we've only been able to create single variables. And you can imagine in even something as, well, relatively simple as Pac-Man, right? Look at all the amount of information our program needs to be holding at any one time. That's quite a lot of information. Even just the XY coordinate of every one of these dots, right? This has to exist somewhere inside variables. And there is no way that we would program this using individual variables, with each with their own lines of code. This would be insane. Okay, so we need some kind of syntax that's going to allow us to manipulate variables on a larger scale, in bulk, so to speak. And this is where arrays come in. Arrays are going to allow us to create essentially variables in bulk, okay, as opposed to single individual variables. And this is really useful because now our programs can be somewhat almost infinitely scalable, right? The same ideas we would previously apply to one variable will now be able to apply to 100 or 1,000 variables and kind of treat them in batch. All right, so first, let's do a bit of an analogy. This is an imperfect analogy, but hopefully it will help you kind of get a mental picture of how arrays are structured under the hood. So imagine this cardboard box here as a variable, okay, where we can only put one thing inside of it, one number, one string, one color, one piece of information. Okay? Just obviously it's an analogy and it's not a perfect one. The box analogy for variables kind of falls apart because really you can have multiple variables referring to the same content, the same value. So a better analogy might be like you have a box, you can put one piece of information inside of it, and then you can put a sticker on it, a label with a name, and you could have multiple stickers if you wanted to. But let's not go too far down that rabbit hole. So if single variables are basically like these boxes where we can put one piece of information inside of them, arrays are more like an egg carton. Okay, so an egg carton, right? We have all these individual locations inside of it. In this case, right, enough to store a dozen eggs or perhaps a dozen variable. So the egg carton gets a name, just like our variable, but then inside of it, it can hold multiple pieces of information. And the way we're going to be able to access and manipulate these individual locations inside the array or the egg carton is going to be through indices. So imagine that every one of these locations in the egg carton has an index associated with it, starting with 0, always. The first one is always going to be 0. And then this index is just a number that goes up by 1. Okay, another way to think about it is like an address, right? So every one of these locations in the egg carton is a place where we can put a value, a variable. Unlike our box that could only store one thing, this egg carton array can store 12 variables inside of it. And we can refer to each one individually, right? When we say this variable is inside that egg carton at location 0 or location 1 and 2 and so forth. So the combination of the name of the variable and the index is going to allow us to address or to access individual values inside an array. Okay? So it's a bit of a clunky analogy, but it's somewhat pretty close to how things are going to work under the hood. All right. So with arrays, we're going to introduce some new syntax. This is just a quick overview. We're just going to dive into code right in a second. to walk through this manually. But the main little bit of syntax we're going to add for arrays are the square brackets. Okay, so whenever we deal with the square brackets in JavaScript, we're always going to be in the realm of arrays. So this is the syntax to declare an array, and we'll go over that again in a second. And then to access elements of an array, we're going to use the square bracket syntax again with an index inside of the square brackets. So let's do an example. I've already created a sketch here with some boilerplate code, so I'm not going to go over that again. It's already been saved. And what I'll do to explain arrays first, before we try programming something, is I'm going to open something called the developer console. Now, this is a little bit different in every browser, but in Chrome, this console, you can find it under Tools, Developer Tools. You click on that, it's going to open this this pane here. Let me see. I just want to clear it. It's going to open this pane here, and this is basically a JavaScript console where we can write some JavaScript code. So I'm going to use that just to kind of walk you through the ideas behind arrays, and then we'll write a P5 program right afterwards. So this is our variable model. Okay, so we know this so far. If we want to declare a variable, right, we use the keyword let, and then we say the name of our variable, and we initialize it to something. And then let's say this variable contained a number. Okay, then my variable here, I can see its value in the console by typing its name, and I can see the value down here. Okay, so if I put that like this, I see that my variable contains the number 10. So I can only ever put one thing inside a variable. By contrast, an array, right? So an array is declared like this. We're going to call this, we still have to give it a name, and all the same rules applies as to variables. We're going to say, let's call it my array for demonstration purposes. We'll say this is equal to square brackets. Okay, so this syntax, this little bit of syntax here means we're creating an empty array. Okay? And now if we take a look inside this variable and print it out, we'll see that we have the square brackets here. I can expand on this little arrow. So now we have an array that's got nothing in it. It's got a length of 0, right? So it's got no elements. And we're not going to dive into the prototype bit. We'll just, let's not worry about this for now. So now that we have an array, we can access individual variable locations inside that array using the same square brackets. Okay? So we are going to say, let's say I go to index 0. Okay, so I'm going to say my array square bracket index 0. Let's make that equal to some number. I don't know, 5. Not really important which number it is. So now, if I look inside my array, I now have the number 5. Okay, and if I expand this, I have location 0 equal to 5, and now I have a length of 1. Okay? Let's keep going. We're going to add another variable. This time we're going to move over one location. We're going to go to index 1, and we are going to make this equal to, I don't know, 15. Okay, these numbers are not important here. So now I've went into location 1 into my array. I've stored another value in there, the number 15. Now, if we take a look inside my array, like so, now we can see that my array has 2 values in it, right? So this is a thing that's now expanding. I have a value at index 0, 5. I have a value at index 1, 15. And I can expand on this to see the list, right? We can see on the left, we have the index and the value, index value. Now I have a length of 2, right? And so on and so forth. I could put something at number index 3. Oh, I skipped over. Okay. That's kind of helpful to look at that. So we're going to put, I'm putting a value here at index 3, okay, number 25. Now, if I print the array, notice that all of a sudden my array has grown to 4 values. Okay. Why is that? Well, we always have to remember with arrays, that takes a little bit of getting used to in the beginning, but the index always starts counting from 0. So the first location is 0, right? Then we have 1. Then I accidentally went to 3, and that means I've skipped location 2, right? I didn't put anything at location 2. So therefore, the array here, we can see we have an empty value, right? We don't have anything at location 2. We have location 0, 1, nothing. Location 3, we have put the number 25. And now technically our array has now the length of 4 because we've introduced a gap in there. And if we went to take a look at what is inside array bracket 2, we get undefined, right? Remember when we talked about variables, undefined just means we have a space for a variable or a value, like the box is there, but it's just got nothing in it. So it's not the same as 0. It just means nothing has been defined, and we don't know if it's going to be a number, if it's going to be a string, right? It's undefined. So the space is there, but it's empty. So this is what undefined means. Okay? So we could go and put in a value in here, and I don't know, putting value, not important. And now this location has been filled, right? So I went to index 2, I put a number. So now I have my array with 4 elements, and it's got 4 numbers in it. So this can keep increasing. We can have really large arrays if we want to. Typically, as we're about to see in a second, we are not going to be creating arrays in that way, like manually populating them with by hand. We're going to rely on loops most of the time to do the work for us. So loops and arrays, great combo. But this is just to kind of walk you through the syntax of working with arrays. Last little bit I want to talk about before we dive into an example is you'll notice here we have this thing called length that's equal to 4. This is something we can access. This is called a property of the array. And we're going to talk about objects in the next video, but just kind of as a preview, arrays are also objects in JavaScript, and they have these attributes or properties. We access them using the dot syntax. So now I can say my array dot length, and that's always going to return the number of elements that have been placed into this array. So unlike the egg carton, right, an array starts empty, and as you add things to it, it grows, and its length property is always going to reflect what size it has reached. So think about this infinitely expanding egg carton that can take any number of variables that we wish to put into it. Of course, the limit being how much memory your computer has, right? Which we're not going to run into that, at least not in this course. All right, so this is the syntax for arrays. Let's put that into practice in a quick little code example. So for this example, what I would like to do is kind of revisit last week's idea of creating these random circles, right, all over, except this time, I don't want to just have to create random circles and then stop the program in order for them to stay put, okay? I would like to be able to, let's say, maybe animate them, okay? Maybe we want them to move around, maybe we want to animate their size, whatever it is. So that means we are going to need a variable for the XY coordinate of each one of the random circles we're going to create. We need to remember where they are in order for our program to be able to draw them inside every frame we redraw and then animate them down the road. So arrays are perfect for this, right? So let's create 2 arrays. We're going to create an array called X, and we're going to create an array called Y. Okay. So these 2 arrays are going to contain the X, Y values of a number of circles we're going to create. And we're going to think of it as at the same index in both of these arrays. Let's say we go to index 0 and X and index 0 and Y. We're going to use this pair of values to draw one circle. It's a little bit clunky to think of it that way as separate arrays. In the next video, we're going to talk about objects, and we'll be able to combine these 2 things, X and Y, into one element. But for this one, we're just going to worry about the array part of it. So first we declare a couple of arrays, right? So we declare some arrays. And they start out empty. So now we need a little bit of code to go in and fill them up with some values, with some numbers. So we could do this by hand, of course, but this kind of defeats the purpose of using arrays. Okay? What we want to be able to do is take advantage of the fact that this index in the array here, this is just a number in our program. Because it's just a number, it means we can programmatically generate the index. We can let the code generate a series of indices for us, and then we can let the code go at each location and put a number inside the array. This is perfect for a for loop. Okay. So in setup here, I'm going to write a little for loop. We covered that last week. And remember, the for loop has 3 ingredients. We have a counter we define. We have a condition for the loop to repeat, and now this is basically saying I'm going to repeat 100 times, right? And we have an increment. I'm just simply going to increment I by steps of 1 every time the loop repeats. Now notice this letter I here. There's a reason why for loops programmers tend to use the letter I as a counter in the for loop. That is short for index. Okay? Kind of shows you that our loops and arrays really go hand in hand. So now we can think of it as the index into our arrays. For instance, we could say X bracket I, okay? So this means this value is going to change as the loop repeats, right? The first time the loop runs, it's going to be bracket 0, and then it's going to increment by steps of 1 until it reaches 99, or the last location in the array if we want to have, let's say, 100 elements. So we could say, what are we going to write down inside this array? Well, let's just create some random numbers for now. Okay? Let's pick a random number along the width, and we'll do the same for the Y array. We'll pick a random number along the height, right, of our screen. So this little bit of code here is going to leverage the power of the for loop, right, to repeat 100 times, and then each time use a different index into our arrays or her giant egg cartons, and go and write down a random number inside each location. Okay? So now what we've essentially done is we've created 200, right, two arrays, so 200 individual variables, except now we have kind of this syntax where we can access them in a batch using a for loop. And then we can do the same in draw. Okay? We can say we have 100 variables inside X, 100 variables inside Y. Let's repeat this for loop here. I'm just going to copy and paste it for simplicity. And then let's look inside each of these locations, grab the values using bracket I, right? Remember, I is just our counter. So we don't know this. We're now programming in more generic terms. Okay, so this we just know that I is going to take through a sequence of numbers. It's going to go through a sequence of numbers, and then we're programming accordingly. We're just saying every time the loop repeats, right? Go into these arrays, but just use a different index. And this is the beauty of it. It's going to cycle through all the available indices for us. And then let's just draw some circles. And then we can hit play. Okay? All right. So let's take a just quick step back and recap what we've done. So first we've declared two arrays, right? One called X, one called Y. At first they're empty, but then in setup, we use a for loop to repeat these two lines of code 100 times. Right? Each time we use the counter inside the loop, our variable I, as an index into the array. The variable I, remember, is just going to go start from 0 and then increase by 1 every time the loop repeats. So this is perfect for arrays. This allows us to go at 100 spots in the array in a sequence and then write some kind of value in there. Now, for simplicity here, I'm just throwing some random numbers inside of it, which oftentimes might be what you want to do, right? Maybe you're writing a game, you want your enemies to kind of start at random locations. Well, just go and start with some random values. So now we've created basically 200, two sets of 100 random variables. And then in draw, we can now go and use them, right, to draw something. Okay? The big difference between this code and last week's code is that we now have a place in our program where we've written down the location of each of these circles, right? This is now stored inside the memory. We have an understanding of where each of these circles are. Whereas last week, we used the for loop to draw random circles, but after we've drawn them, we had no idea where these circles were because we never recorded their location inside variables. We didn't have the ability to do that with individual variables. You can imagine this would go crazy. We would need 100 X's, 100 Y's to do the same thing with individual variables, and we can no longer leverage the for loop. This is a huge important difference. Okay? Now we could animate these circles if we wanted to. Let's prove this by doing a little bit of code here that's going to change the size of each circle based on how far away they are from the mouse cursor. Okay? Because we know the location of each circle, we have this inside these two arrays now. We are now able to do something like this. We can do this calculation. So let's create a variable called d here. I'm going to declare a little local variable called d, short for diameter, and we're going to calculate the distance, right, between any one of these circles and where the mouse is. So we saw this is very easy to do. There is a function called dist in p5.js that will do this calculation for us. So if you give two different points to the dist function, it will simply basically measure how far apart these 2 points are in pixels. So we know the first point we want to measure from, it's going to be the mouse cursor. So that's mouse X, mouse Y. And then the second point we want to measure from, well, it's going to vary as the loop repeats. Okay, we want to do this for every circle we're drawing. So therefore, we are going to simply use this coordinate over here, x bracket I, y bracket I. Okay? So this means something different depending on the value of I. And because our loop repeats, again, in a sequence, this is going to take turns. It's going to repeat 100 times, and every time we're going to be looking at a different circle based on the value of our counter, I. All right. And then instead of drawing each of them at 100 pixel diameter, let's plug in this D number inside of it, okay, to see what that looks like. Nice. So this is a little bit intense. So essentially what it means is the further away I am from a circle, the bigger its diameter, right? And then the closer I get, it basically disappears. Okay? So we get kind of this marshmallow effect. This is a little bit intense, so we could tone it down a bit. I'm going to say, I'm going to divide it by 2 after I've done this. Just see what happens. Okay. There we go. Yeah, this is just we have a little bit more room here to walk around. We can see the effect a little bit better. So this highlights the fact that we can now animate each of these circles, right? We have these persistent coordinates for each circles, x and y, right? And we can refer to them using their individual variables. The difference with individual variables is now we need 2 things to refer to some value inside an array. We need first the name of the array, right? Whether it's, in this case, array x or array y. And then in combination with that, we need an index. So those 2 things together point us to a single number. If we only said x or y by itself, well, this would have no meaning in this context anymore because x and y now represent 100 numbers each. Okay, so we have to be more specific. We have to say which x and which y, and we do this using bracket index syntax. Let's do one other little improvement here. Notice these 2 for loops, right? I've set them to repeat same number of times because this first one is kind of like initializing the arrays, okay? And then down here, we're using the arrays to draw a bunch of circles, okay? So these 2 for loops have to be the same number of repetitions. If I make this one bigger, right, I'm going to run into some problems because I only created 100 variables in each of these up here, right? I could make it smaller, but then I would have some waste. I would have some variables I'm not using. So once we've decided here, this is the number of circles we're going to create, essentially by setting the number of repetitions, we can be more clear here. Instead of having to repeat 100, we could simply look at, let's say we're going to look at x, and we're going to say, x, how many variables do you contain? And we can access that using the length property of the array. So we can say x.length, right? And this is always going to be correct. So if we create 100 circles up here, x.length will be 100. If we create 10 circles up here, then now x.length is 10, and so forth. Y.length will be the same, so I just picked x. I could have used y here as well. It would do the same thing. If I do 500, right, same difference, same number of values. Now I just have a lot of these circles. So whenever possible, right, we're going to try to use the length property in when we're writing our for loops that are going to iterate over arrays. This way we don't make mistakes, right? We can just decide once how many variables we're putting inside the arrays, and then afterwards in our program we can use x.length or name of the array.length to refer to its size. Okay? We don't even need to remember how many or know how many variables are contained inside of it. Even better, down the road, we're going to learn about kind of dynamically adding and removing things from arrays when we program our game. And this is going to start to become even more important because the size of the array might change as the program is running. Okay, so instead of hard coding its size, we're going to always just ask the array, how many variables do you contain? And we're always going to have the right answer as a result. Okay. So let's do just a little bit more here. Let's give each of these circles a color, let's say. Okay. So now we have an x, y value for each of the circles in this program. Let's say I wanted each of them to get their own color. Okay, maybe to mix it up from last week, instead of making the colors totally random, we're going to make it so that we choose from a set of 3 colors. Okay, so they can get a random color, but only one of 3 possible colors. And I need to be able to write this down because as my program runs, I'm redrawing every circle in every frame. See, we're clearing the background, right? This is what allows the animation to occur. If we did not have background in here, right, this looks kind of cool, but this is not what I was going after. Okay, so the background essentially is giving us a fresh slate at the beginning of every run through draw, and then we have to redraw the entire sketch in order to get the animation effect. So I can do this because I know where each circle is. If I wanted to set a different fill color for each circle, right, I would need a variable for each of them. I need a place to say, you over there, you're green, and you're blue, and you're red, right? And then just record all of this just like I'm recording their position up here. So anytime you want to add detail to a program, usually the answer is probably you need some more variables to store that information. So let's create an array called colors. Okay, I'm just going to create this here for now. And just as a starting point here, we are going to say colors bracket I equals, let's just start giving them all the same color. Okay, so I'm just going to make them all blue, okay, for now. And we're going to replace this with a random color in a second. And then in draw, whenever it's time to draw a circle, we're going to say, hey, what is the colors value, right? What is the value we put inside the array color at index I? So I'm going to use the same index, right, for all 3 arrays. And that means each circle gets its own set of variables. Okay? So now they're all the same, right? But I've created now a space where I can write down a color for each circle in this program. So we could make some code here that would randomize like we did last week based on the RGB values or the hue saturation brightness. But just to show you another way that we can do this is we are going to choose colors from a predetermined palette. Now the palette is going to be a set of, let's say, 3 colors, or it could be 10 colors, it doesn't matter. So you may guess, like, how are we going to store these colors, right? We need a place to write down the value of 3 separate colors, and it'd be great if they could all live inside this one container, this one variable. You've guessed it, we're going to create an array to store our palette. Let's call it a palette. Okay? Now, we can declare arrays like this, empty arrays, but when we have like small arrays, we can also go and when we declare the array, we can initialize right away a few values inside the array. So this is the syntax we're going to use right now. So let's say I want to create this palette. I'm going to fill it with some HTML color codes. Okay, so let's say we're going to go with this color. I've looked up these colors beforehand. This is going to give me a nice, a few like greens, different kind of hues of green. And let's add another color here. This one, let's go with this. Okay. So what I've done here is I've created an array called palette, and it has 3 elements. And I've both declared the array and initialized some values inside of it at the same time. So this is something we can do with JavaScript. So this is useful for small arrays like this, maybe that contains some predetermined values, right? So now I have this palette array has 3 values in it. So instead of colors equal blue here, I could say palette bracket 0, right? This is now this color over here. I could say palette bracket 1. This is the next color that I've created, the middle color, and then bracket 2. Oops, bracket 2 is the last one. Okay, now I have these colors. Okay, so just 3 shades of green. Now imagine if I wanted each circle to get a different one chosen at random. Okay, instead of always the same color, there's a few ways I could do this. The harder way would be to just go and pick a random number that corresponds to an index into this array. So if I had a way to generate a random number between 0, 1, and 2, I could select a color at random. There's an even easier way in P5. We can just use the random function to do this for us. So the random function can take an array as its input. And if we do that, it will simply select a random value from that array as the value that it's going to return. So if I say random palette, okay, this is an array now. So the random function knows to say, oh, okay, this is an array. So what you want me to do is choose one at random inside this array and then output the answer, put it into this, this colors array over here. So we can do that. So now we can have an array called, let's say, palette, right? And then we can randomly select a value from it, put that into our colors array. And remember, we have 100 of these, right? So even though we're choosing from 3 possible colors, we still need a place to write down, so to speak, the color of each individual circle, so that when it comes time to draw our frame, our program knows to look up that color and use it consistently from frame to frame. Okay? So now we've created 3 sets of variables, right? X, Y, color, all of them random. And then we have the diameter of the circle. That's something that's kind of changing on the fly. We did not create an array for this one because we are calculating this value, recalculating this value every time we run a frame, okay? Because it's dependent on the mouse cursor and X and Y. Okay? So there's no need to remember this distance, at least not in this program. We can just calculate it on the fly using a local variable. All right, there's a lot of great color palette generator tools online, by the way. If you Google color palette generator, it's something I like to do quite a bit. You're able to access these HTML color codes, so you can kind of put them straight into an array. One that I like to use, it's called Coolers, I believe. There's a whole bunch of them. Sure, take your cookies. And let's see, Coolers, let's look at some trendy palettes. I'm going to show you real quick how we can bring, let's say I like this palette, right? I'm going to export it. I'm going to export it as code. And this is going to give me an array here that I can grab. Why can't I select? Copy to the clipboard. Okay. Let's go up in here. Let's see what that gave us. Holy moly. Okay, so that's way too much stuff. I'm just going to keep the array portion here. Just delete the rest. And that can become my array. The only catch is that this particular tool doesn't put the hashtag in front of the colors, and p5.js wants to see that. So I'm just going to go ahead and put the hashtag real quick. So this is a quick way of just getting a whole bunch of colors that will look good together. So here I have more than 3, but it doesn't matter because my program knows to adapt accordingly, right? So now I have a palette that has more than 3 colors. It's going to get random value from here. And now this is the new color palette that we're using for this sketch. So a little detour, but there's a whole bunch of these sites out there. This is one I tend to use, but there's many others like it. And yeah, so we'll leave it at that. This video is getting a little bit long. In the next video, we're going to do one more example built on arrays this week, except this time we're going to animate some shapes, get them to move around the screen. And we're also going to introduce the notion of objects with a little bit more detail. I'll see you in the next one.